to do here is give giving a little of the background in the Catholic Church's social teaching. It's the background and the context for what Pope Francis is saying now. And I'm trying to show that this is not brand new. You know, the Pope is not way out there. He's not coming up with brand new, inventing new concepts and new doctrines. This goes way back at least for over 100 years. And it can be traced back to Scripture. Pope John XXIII in 1961 said that he quoted his predecessor, Pope Pius XII, the right of every person to use these for his own sustenance is prior to every other economic right, even that of private property. The right to property cannot stand in the way of the axiomatic principle that the goods which were created by God for all people should flow to all alike, according to the principles of justice and charity. Now this is there, Pope John XXIII was citing the words of Pope Pius XII going back to 1941. So there is a right to private property, but it's not unconditional. It's not absolute. There are some limits on it. Now this is interesting in relation to a country like ours. We think about the division, the distribution of wealth in this country is becoming more and more lopsided. It's just more and more wealth being accumulated at the very top, 1% of the population. And so it's prosperity for them and for a certain class of people immediately below them, but it means more and more hardship and difficulties for the majority of people, even in this country. How do we respond to these kinds of problems? Do we just get downcast and sad and hopeless? No, that wouldn't help at all. But we do have to be realistic in looking at reality as it is, looking at the harsh realities that we live in. Otherwise, we'll be doing things that will never get to the root causes of the problems. So Pope John XXIII, again in 1961, 3 stages. And this, I think we could see as kind of a method for your research, method for your social research as students. First, you look at the concrete situation, okay? But you really have to see it as it is, and not just as the media, or in some ways, academia sometimes presents a very one-sided, a very partial view of reality. And then you form a judgment on it in the light of principles. Depends on what your principles are, what your judgment is going to be. As Christians, we believe in that we are all brothers and sisters. We believe that we are to love one another as Jesus loved us. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, that you have love for one another, and so forth. We know his own statements about wealth. He invited the rich young man to follow him. He did not. He was too attached to his wealth. Jesus spoke about the rich fool, this guy who had more crops, more products of his farm than he knew what to do with, so he built larger and better barns, and then he died next day. So the Gospels are filled with that kind of critique of the idolization of money, the idolization of profit. So you form judgments based on your principles. Marxists, socialists, would have their principles. They may see a Christian dimension to their socialist or Marxist principles, or they may not. But we need to define our principles and then judge the realities that we're seeing according to those principles. Is this good or bad? And then you decide what in a certain canon should be done to implement these principles. So that's key, I think, for this Pope. He's not interested in giving abstract theories or doctrines. He's trying to move the world, and he has the world as a stage to a certain extent, trying to move us to take action to try to solve some of these problems. So it's expressed in the three terms: look or see, judge, act. Another encyclical means a long letter written by a pope, and there have been a number of them during the century. Now here, Pope Paul VI in 1967 just referred to this statement by in the Epistle of John. That's fairly clear. Doesn't require any comment. I would also recommend the letter of James. If you want to see some radical material about the rich and the poor, I would just recommend the letter of James.
Now, this verse is very significant, verse 4 of chapter 5 of the letter of James, which we've been looking at. Here we can see that what is wrong with wealth in some cases. And what we find here is that these owners or the employers have accumulated their wealth on the basis of not paying their workers. Today we might say that much wealth is accumulated by owners who do not pay a just wage to their workers.
The popes, in their social doctrine, their social teaching, they go back to it's called the early fathers of the church. This would be in usually the first 4 or 5 centuries. And some of them had some very, we would say, radical statement. Radical means going to the root, from radix. The word radix is Latin for root. So radical is not always a bad thing. Some people would say, oh, you're a radical. Usually means you're a troublemaker. Well, no, the word itself just means going to the root of things. So St. Ambrose, you can read that for yourself. Again, that the poor person has a right to what you may be giving him, or you're giving him what is his. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich. So this is background going back many centuries, foundation for what some of the popes have said in recent times. So yes, the Catholic Church says each person has a right to private property. That means also the poor and those who have nothing. When the church says every person has a right to private property, this means that those who have nothing, have no property, they have, they're homeless, they're starving, they have a right to some private property. But then those who have a lot and have more than they need, more than they know what to do with, well, their right is not absolute and unconditional. Here's a concept that's important, a word that is sometimes misunderstood, the word liberalism. In political philosophy, it has to do with the absolute freedom for capital. Liberal means free, as in liberty or liberation. In classical liberalism or neoliberalism, in both, it's freedom for capital, not for each individual person, much less for the poor. It's freedom, absolute freedom for capital, for private business, private interests, private corporations, to be free from government regulation, taxation, and so forth, to be free of any obligations to others, to be free of any obligations to pay a just wage. You know, it's that kind of freedom. It's a totally self-centered concept of freedom. The international imperialism of money. So when it becomes international, then it begins to affect other countries. You know, so you have one country invading another to protect its corporations. You know, if there's a revolution in Cuba or Nicaragua or a socialist government that was elected in Chile, 1970, that the government will move in to overthrow that in the protection of our private property, that is, in the protection of the private property of U.S. corporations. Again, the deified market, Pope Francis talks a lot about that. The market is not bad in itself, but when that becomes deified and the rules of the market prevail and predominate over every other consideration, like ecology, like the survival of the majority of people, the well-being of children and so forth, you just say the rules of the market need to prevail and run society and the world in which we live, then it's become a god. You know, money has become a god. The Pope loves everyone, rich and poor alike. This is Pope Francis, our current Pope. Because some people say, well, he says the church should be a church of the poor and for the poor, and he hangs around with poor people all the time. He always did. As Archbishop in Argentina, he was always in the slums, hanging around with poor people. And rich people say, wow, he hates us then. He doesn't like us. He doesn't love us. How can he be a Christian if he doesn't love us? See? Well, here he addresses that. He loves everyone, rich and poor alike. but he is obliged in the name of Christ to remind all that the rich must help, respect, and promote the poor. So he's, and that's for our benefit. I don't know if you consider yourself rich, but probably not. But in the context of the world, the whole world in which we live, almost everybody living in the States, unless you're among that 25% or whatever living in considerable poverty, but we're rich as far as most of the population of the world is concerned. So it's a real invitation to us, you know, to change, to grow in love, to let our hearts break or bleed because of our love for other people as we come to know them, their names and faces, and then to be involved in the struggle, to be involved in something worthwhile, to have meaning in life. You know, many people who are just accumulating more and more wealth, all they do is buy bigger and more expensive toys. Now you can get a submarine now for about $1 million. Have your own little submarine go around it. Imagine working, and many of them work very hard. Now many capitalists do not. They just, their money works hard. If somebody is just sitting on $1 billion, then he or she doesn't have to work. They just have to figure out where to invest things. But many people work very, very hard. They knock themselves out. They literally kill themselves almost to have more and more things. And yet it's all pretty much for nothing because all they're getting is bigger and more expensive toys. And sometimes they refer to that. They say, oh, I got this new Cadillac or Jaguar or something, you know, and a toy, I have a nice new toy. And I said, well, is that what life is all about? Is that what you're knocking yourself out for in your work, working 12 hours, 15 hours a day, just to have more toys? I mean, you know, there's no meaning in that. It's like the rich man who had to build more and more barns for his crops, and then he died the next day. And Jesus, you know, he invited, as I said, he invited the rich young man to follow him. Give up what you have, sell what you have, give to the poor, come follow me. And it says the rich young man went away sad. It says that Jesus looked at him with love. Jesus looked at this rich young man with love because he was offering him a real blessing. He was offering him a meaningful life, a life in community. Come follow me, come get with my group, be part of my group, and we'll work together and we'll share and we'll celebrate and pray together and so forth, and work for the kingdom, work for the coming of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of justice and peace. It's a beautiful invitation to meaningfulness in life. But it involves not just blessing the wealth, the super wealth of the super rich. That doesn't mean, that's not loving them, because they're living a life without meaning, and they may be hurting a lot of people. A lot of people get rich by hurting other people, exploiting the workers or exploiting Mother Earth. Now, this is interesting too about violence. Some people might say, oh, well, he's justifying crime then. You know, he's justifying thieves, stealing. Well, he's not, but he is pointing out a connection between security and, we would say, social justice. We're never going to have security if there are more and more people in desperate straits for their daily survival and their survival of their children. So to eliminate violence, we need to eliminate the causes, the roots of violence. His final visit was in Paraguay. Here, I think he has some remark for young people, and he speaks about the devil. To me, it doesn't matter too much whether there is a being called the devil or Satan. I know there is evil. I know there is evil in the world, and I know it's in me, and it's in everybody to a certain extent. I don't know whether it's the devil or not. I don't think here. But he seems to use this sort of traditional term, the devil. If you do certain things, you will be happy. Everybody wants to be happy in life. It depends on what our view of happiness is, what our view of life and the meaning of life is. So if you do certain things, you'll be happy. But then you realize you weren't happy at all. Sometimes it makes you feel more empty, even sad. Okay? Using other people for our own pleasure, for our own convenience, we may think, well, that will make me happy. But it doesn't. We end up feeling more empty or even sad. So the devil promises us what is divisive, comparing ourselves to others. You may have moments of sadness and anxiety because you're comparing yourself to others. And, who says that the other is better or is a more fulfilled or more complete human person because he or she has done this or that, or he or she has this or that. And if you compare yourself to them, then you can have great anxiety and you feel you're not measuring up, not measuring up to whose standards. We need to have our own standards, not our parents' standards, not our peers' standard, not the media's standards, certainly. Stepping over others in order to get what we want. This is something that many people live by. Stepping over people. I get what I want. Disregard other people or use them, throw them away, or hurt them. The devil is a con artist, but we have to abandon our friends, never to stand by anyone. And the final sentence there, which I put in bold, he makes you think that your worth depends on how much you possess. This is very common in this country. We might say, well, our worth, our happiness, our fulfillment depends not on how much I possess, but on what I'm doing, whether I'm doing something that I find meaningful, using my talents, and being in solidarity with others, and not just using and stepping on other people to get up, to get ahead. Loving and being loved. This is probably the basic thing. Loving and being loved is the key to happiness, not on what I possess. I mean, we all have to have basics, that's for sure. And that's even harder and harder for many people to get nowadays. Seed is sown along the road, but they've heard the word, that is, they've heard the call of the gospel, let's say the call of their heart in a way. They've heard the values of love, the values of solidarity, but the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of riches, or the lure of riches, and the desires for other things choke the word and it becomes unfruitful. So again, I think when the Pope and other popes really criticize in a fundamental way the deification of money, wealth, profit, and so forth, they're really being very gospel very much in line with the Gospels. True happiness not found in designer clothing or expensive brand name shoes. Drawing near to others, learning how to weep. You might say, well, how can learning how to weeping, how can that be part of real happiness? Well, it is, because it's part of love. And then Jesus speaks of joy, that at the Last Supper, that your joy may be complete.